Hello, everyone. Welcome to the Knowledge Management Community of TC's August 2022 monthly meeting. Today, we are very fortunate to have Dr. Johel Brown-Grant, a wonderful knowledge management expert in our area. He's going to be presenting on designing knowledge, capitalizing on the connections between KM and design thinking. Take it away, Johel.
Okay, let's see. Let's get to the top of the presentation and we get started right away.
Okay.
Okay, everybody, hello, welcome to tonight's discussion on designing knowledge, capitalizing on the connections between design thinking and knowledge management. My name is Johel Brown-Grant, and I will be discussing this topic with you tonight. The way we're thinking about doing this is we're going to have a little bit of an interactive discussion. I'm going to bring up a few concepts, and in between, I'll have a few provocative questions to kind of get the conversation going. I'll try to switch back and forth between the full screen so that I can see if there is any question. Or if not, raise your hand so that the host can give you the mic. I don't know if the chat is now available. But I'll take moments where I'll stop and ask for questions as well, just in case anybody has any question or comment they want to contribute to tonight's presentation. I'm not sure if Pascal or Tara, who are the owners of the chat, of the team, are available. So I don't know if we should. I'll go ahead and get started, and then if they come on along and then they want to take a minute to give a few remarks, then we'll do so. So I know that the chat is now available, so please, if you have any questions or comments, you can also go in the chat to make your questions, remarks. So this is going to be about 40 to 45 minutes. And then we will have a period at the end where we will get into a discussion with questions and comments. And what we'll try to do is to think about examples that we've seen from our daily lives, in our day-to-day. And most of all, we'll be looking at applications, thinking about what the applications might look like. So again, I'm going to get started. My name is Johel Brown-Grant, and I will be leading the discussion tonight. So the topic is one that is very interesting. It's about how do we, design thinking is a topic that is pretty much, everybody's talking about it. There are organizations that are hiring people to come in and do design thinking for various purposes. And the design thinking, and this is why I have the knowledge of the title of designing knowledge, is there is a connection between design thinking and knowledge management. But that connection is not necessarily always discussed, exploited, looked at from a perspective that would allow the actual design thinking process to yield information that is also helpful for the organization as a whole when it comes to capturing and sharing critical knowledge. So the point of the discussion today is to explore a little bit of that. Again, we have a very short time, so we won't be able to get into the most, complex and deepest discussion. But I want to just be a little bit provocative and bring a few things in your mind for those of you who are knowledge management practitioners or people interested in knowledge management, or for those of you who are in design thinking and are kind of thinking about how this relates or connects with knowledge. So I'm going to move to the next slide now that we've given a little bit of a background. And just let me stop for a quick second. to also give you a little bit of background about myself, some of you might have seen it in the bio. I am a knowledge management practitioner, and I have a background in user experience design, human-computer interaction. I have worked in the software industry. I've worked in higher education, and I currently work in the federal government. And I've been doing research on the user experience in many different facets for many years, from what is the learner experience, the customer experience, using stories to understand the user journeys. So I'm very familiar with this world, and the conversation today will be a little bit of some of the things that I have gleaned from my experiences and projects, design projects that I've been involved in. Okay, so I just want to give you a sense of what we'll be talking about. Okay, Tara is not able to connect, but she's on the phone. So hi, Tara, it's good to have you here, and we'll connect in the future. So I just want to give you a little bit of a sense of what we're going to be talking about. First thing is going to be just to give you a little bit of why are we talking about this concept, and I mentioned a little bit of that earlier on. What's the rationale for bringing these two topics into one discussion arena? Then a little bit of the concepts, just to kind of get our minds into thinking, have a conceptual foundation so that we have a sense of what we're talking about when we talk about knowledge management, design thinking, etc. Then we will get into a little bit of the process. So what happens when knowledge management and design thinking are coming into the same analysis, and then we will look at a specific what this means in terms of analyzing the process, and we'll get into some conclusions. And like I said at the beginning, between each of these sections, I'll have some provocative questions that these are for us to kind of think, and there's no right or wrong answer. If you feel like you want to respond, either in the chat or by getting your mic. Again, they are provocative questions, so they might be a little bit, they might get you to think about it, about the whole discussion in many different ways. Is anybody? It says it appears I am not. I guess I'm not. I can't hear anybody. I hope you guys can hear me. Can you hear me, Bill? I'm looking at the chat.
Okay.
I can hear you.
I can hear you.
Let's see if my audio. I think my audio should be. Give me 1 second. Okay, folks can hear me. For some reason, I can't hear anybody. So let's see. Just want to double check my audio. It should be. Okay. Bill, can you hear me?
I can hear you. Can you hear me?
Okay, I'm still having some issues with the audio.
Okay.
But since you can hear me, I will go ahead. I'll try to see if I can fix that problem. For some reason, I'm not sure why I can't hear anybody. Okay, let's get back to the presentation. So here in terms of the concept, I wanted to kind of take a minute to first talk about what is design thinking, because there's a lot of concepts out there. There are a lot of ways to see design thinking. Design thinking sometimes mean different things to different people in different organizations. So I wanted to take a minute to kind of just look at the concept of design thinking. So according to the Interaction Design Foundation, design thinking, this is one of the definitions that you will see out there. I just picked one so that to kind of establish a base. It's a nonlinear iterative process to understand users, challenge assumptions, redefine problems, create innovative solutions. So the main thing here is that it's an iterative process. That's where we're going to zero in to think about knowledge. And then in terms of knowledge management, as many of you knowledge management know, there are many different definitions of knowledge management. I picked one just again to have a basis. Identify, capturing, evaluating, retrieving, and sharing knowledge, all of enterprises' information assets. So this is just for us to think about, well, what is knowledge management and what is design thinking on a theoretical level, what we see in terms of what's written out there. But then what I wanted to contrast that is with what design thinking really is and what knowledge management really is. And this is what we're talking about from a practical perspective. From a practical perspective, both design thinking and knowledge management are about behaviors. They're about practices. They're about tactics and strategies that we apply in different times, in different ways throughout the life of a project or an initiative. So in spite of the definitions that we may have, what I want us to focus on is what is happening when you are implementing either knowledge management or design thinking. They're pretty similar in the sense that it's about behaviors, it's about getting people to do things that will bring change and bring either enhancements or improvements to a particular process. Okay, Allison is saying that we didn't get a chance to introduce ourselves, and if you are able, as Allison did, please go ahead and do so in the chat. I'll ask you to go ahead and do so. Thank you, Allison, for providing that information. So in terms of what design thinking is and what is, that's fine, Bill. I know you guys are working through some technical issues, so that is perfectly fine. We can go ahead and continue. So yeah, if you are able, please introduce yourselves in the chat. So let's get back to the discussion then. So the point that I'm trying to make here is that design thinking and knowledge management, from the outset, there are certain commonalities in terms of what both of these concepts bring to the table to our practice as professionals. So now that we have that sort of that basis in terms of what design thinking is and what knowledge management is, now let's get into a different part of the discussion. Before I get to that, I'm going to bring up one of the questions that I talked about that was a little bit provocative. So I want to take a minute first for reactions to the definition, for any questions to that, or an answer to this question. What examples of design thinking have you used or seen in the workplace? Sorry, let me go back here. So yeah, so what examples? I'm sorry, let me go back. My screen moved a little bit ahead. What examples of design thinking have you seen or have you used? Has anybody had any experience using design thinking? And well, Allison says the agile methodology, that's pretty good. Yeah, that allows you to kind of have that iterative process. Journey maps, yeah. Anybody else? Perfect. Innovation processes. And of course, Bill, great to know you're certified in design thinking, so I'm sure you can sort of bring a lot of context to the discussion as well. This is awesome. Great. So I kind of wanted for us to kind of start thinking about where to kind of situate design thinking in practical terms. As you know, Tura said, journey maps, using the agile methodology, using innovation processes. These are places where you apply processes that allow you to go ahead and look at the end user, look at defining problems, trying to come up with prototypes that will allow you to get to a particular solution. And in each of these steps, that's where where we will be looking at knowledge, how knowledge comes in. So, and thank you everybody for going into the chat and introducing yourself. It's great to see so many people, from the area working either in design thinking or knowledge management and in other areas. So now the question is, and I mentioned this at the beginning, why do we explore, why do we want to explore the connections between design thinking and knowledge management? And my idea here, and I'd be interested in seeing your opinion on this, is the reason why we want to discuss about, now we talk about knowledge management and design thinking, is that first of all, we design with knowledge. So when we're going through a design process, it's knowledge that we're using to design, to go through the design process. We need knowledge. The other one is we design for knowledge. So we design so that we can create new knowledge. We design so that we can implement a process that is set around knowledge. Or we design because we want to transform knowledge. For example, design is a process where you put something together and that results in a product that may offer new knowledge or redefine knowledge. So one of the things that is interesting about design thinking is that design thinking is, in many ways, it's a process by which you take tacit knowledge that exists in your head and make it into explicit knowledge. And that explicit knowledge is the product or the resulting process that comes out of the design thinking process. So this is why I'm saying that there is an actual connection between design thinking and knowledge management, because the process is about knowledge, the process generates knowledge, the process transforms knowledge, and the knowledge feeds back into, as you will see in the next slide, it's a continuous loop. As you're going through the design process, knowledge is being generated, transformed, changed. So that's why it's important to come to design thinking with that knowledge management perspective, because every step of the design process, the design thinking process, is an opportunity to capture and share knowledge. So from the knowledge management perspective, what we want to think about is, what's the most effective way to do that? How do you find critical knowledge in each of those discrete steps that you pursue in the design thinking process? So before I go further, I want to stop for a second in case anybody has a question. Welcome, John Howell. John Howell is a friend of mine, doing great work with conversational leadership. So welcome, John. Okay. Yeah, that's a good question. John says he's often wondered how the empathy step links between the two. So we'll talk about that in a second, John, but the empathy step is actually one of the most interesting steps in terms of tacit knowledge, because that's where you get people to open up. But we'll talk about it in a little bit more. So Alison said, I would argue that the empathy piece is ensuring that design thinking and knowledge are informed by human, yes, not only technology, exactly. So that's our first intro into tacit knowledge, John and Alison, you guys got it right. That empathy piece, because we're actually talking to people, this is where things like storytelling come into play. When we're trying to find out who people are and how we connect with each other. That empathy is about connecting, it's about understanding who people are. So the one of the ways to do that is precisely by unlocking that tacit knowledge for people to tell us how they feel, etc. So that's one of the reasons why I was saying that when you are going through design thinking, you're designing with knowledge, for knowledge, you're transforming with knowledge, because the knowledge that is in the heads of the people that we are working with, that empathy process, that knowledge comes out when you go through that empathy process. And that's what you're going to use for the other steps. And Tura says not to diminish the value of this conversation at all. I think that both KM and design thinking inform our organizational development activities, so naturally they support each other. Of course, yes, of course. And then this is, as you say, John, the entire field of organizational design is about precisely bringing these two. And I agree with you, Turo. The thing about the point that we're looking at here is precisely to bring this conversation to the surface, that when we're looking at design thinking, we're looking at knowledge management, we're looking at knowledge. And sometimes it's nice to kind of remind people that the processes run in many ways parallel to each other. So design thinking is not just design thinking on its own out there, and knowledge management is not just knowledge management on its own out there, just as the same with organizational development. So I have another provocative question here. Let's see. Let me move forward. Yes, Tura, you're right. We can't effectively do either of them in isolation. That's why it's important to have, and again, that goes to this question that I have here. How would you apply design thinking to a KM project? Again, a provocative question, but it goes a little bit to what you're saying, Tura. Depending on the relation between design thinking and knowledge, I can understand design thinking as a tool or as a process. Yes. You're right, Monica. It can be used as a tool, but it's also a process. It really depends on what you're pursuing. So how would you apply design thinking to a KM project? Allison says, iterative, customer informed. That's what we do at perfect. Yes, yes. You have to bring the customer into the process. And that's what in some circles is called, participatory design, where you work with either the participant to gather the knowledge throughout the entire process. Focus groups, workshops, document analysis, those are all great, yes. Focus on business needs, even those not well understood, absolutely. The business needs are, again, that's really what informs what we do. And the reason why I bring this question to the forefront is because sometimes some knowledge management practitioners, they focus on having the project and making sure that they hit all the marks on certain parts of a KM project, whether it is the metrics or value for the organization, et cetera. But sometimes also that focus on who is the beneficiary of the knowledge that is going to be captured and shared. How is that knowledge going to be captured and shared in a way that is effective, in a way that that helps them apply their knowledge to the day-to-day, practices. How can we make that effective? This is where design thinking can help. So design thinking, basically, as John said, from an organizational development perspective, it brings design thinking when you look at it in the context of or operating in tandem with knowledge management. It allows you a greater set of strategies, ideas, tools to move forward when you are working on either KM or design thinking initiatives. Because the other thing could be, and maybe this is a question for Bill, if we flip this question around, we say, how would you apply knowledge management to a design thinking process? Which is, again, just the other way, the other side of the question. But if you're working in a design thinking project, how would you bring that process of capturing knowledge and and sharing it? So I am going to go. Let's see if there's any other question or any comment before we go to the next part of it. Tura says design practices would support very well the very careful study required for the development of knowledge books that attempt to capture tacit knowledge. Yes, Tura, you're absolutely right. And then, yes, John, you're asking, how do you bring storytelling into this? So this is one of the things that we'll talk about, but one of the places where, simple answer, storytelling can apply at every step. Storytelling you can use at the process where you're creating empathy. That's the perfect place for that, because it's through stories where you get to know who people really are. That's how you connect with them. When you're a designer and you are trying to, that's why people in design try to do user stories. The problem sometimes with the user stories is that the user stories become like stock photographs. It's like very sort of generic. And sometimes you need to do a little bit more. You need to, when you're trying to get through that empathy process. So a stock story, a generic John Doe story can be an initial jump off point, but you want to use the story to dig a little bit deeper, because all users are different, all user needs are different. So that's one place where storytelling can work. But then when you go through the other steps, just the defining what the problem is, or what the circumstance is, or what the situation is, what better way to sort of define it by telling a story? This story sums up what you're thinking about the problem, and sometimes it's the easiest way to explain to define the problem by telling a story. And so I'll come back to storytelling when we get into the actual analysis and the design thinking. So now let's move on to the next point. So, and this is kind of what we've been talking about. The design the design knowledge, what I call the design knowledge process, how knowledge is designed, or merging design thinking and knowledge management. So basically what we're seeing when we're talking about these processes is, obviously, as we said before, they're iterative acts. And that's crucial because at every step, as I mentioned before, as knowledge is being designed, the knowledge process informs the design process, and so on and so forth. So one of the things that I will talk about is that point of entry and exit, where where a particular one step in the process, it may yield knowledge that then informs the next process, and so on and so forth. And then the other thing that's important that I want to bring to your attention is the process of that there are multiple types of knowledge that are occurring in the this process where we talk about designing knowledge, merging design thinking and knowledge management. So there is the knowledge, like I mentioned before, about the knowledge about the design, the product that you're trying to design, or the solution that you're trying to find, or the understanding you're trying to gain from the user. But then there is also the knowledge about the whole process. Is the process working? What are you learning from the process as you're going through it? That's also knowledge that comes into play. For example, that's why when you go through like the prototyping, you learn things about the product that make you go back either to the design. So that's knowledge that is being generated and used at the same time. So that's why we talk about entry and exit points, because the knowledge comes in one format and then it exits in another format in another step in the process. So this is where we wanted to kind of take a minute to kind of think about, in general, knowledge and design, it is an iterative process, whether you look at it from a design thinking, knowledge management, organizational development point of view. So that's why I wanted to bring this process to your attention. I want to take this a minute to stop here just to see if there is any question on this particular part of the discussion. So if you have any questions, just go ahead and put it in the chat. So we have Denise says, organizational development and knowledge management specialist. Oh, you are an organizational development and knowledge management specialist at OAS. Welcome. Happy to have you here with us. You say that iteration helps to clarify understanding at every step and helps the design evolve throughout the process of iterative design. Awesome. That's a great point, Denise. You really want to have the that element of clarification right there. You're talking about knowledge. Every step is a point of knowledge, entry, exit. And then and that's why we talked about something like participatory design, Denise, because when you bring the participant, that's one element where you have that sort of feedback loop where you're designing, but you're also getting feedback on the process. Now, if I get a little bit geeky on this, one of the criticisms about the design, the participatory design process, is that at some point, then the participant then either becomes a designer, or there is either the information becomes a little bit too either redundant, or as somebody may say, how much can you get out of a particular participant how much is too much. So there's some discussions on that, but it still goes back to your point, Denise. So yes, Ashanti is asking about a real life example. So for example, let's talk about, let's see, I just want to make sure I don't miss anybody in this. So if we're talking about using design thinking, let me tell you about an example that I have been working on with some teams recently. We were using design thinking to look at how could we redesign a space that is used for training, but it's the physical space is used for training, but there's a lot more. There are it's a space that folks use so that they can get themselves ready to move on to go and do diplomatic work. So one of the things that we've been looking at applying design thinking processes is looking at how can we arrange the physical space so that the elements that folks see when they come into that physical space can inform the process and the journey that they have to follow to be able to prepare themselves to go and work abroad. So one of the things that we've been looking at in that design process is, first of all, thinking about, well, what is the current problem? What is the problem that we have? When people come into the space, they might not have a sense of where they need to go or where they need to start doing research for the process they're about to embark in. So one of the things that we talked about, well, is how do we make it? How do we visualize? How do we put some sort of a visual marker for people to know where do they start in the physical room, and then so that they can also have a mental model of the whole process. And then the other thing, going back to the design process, to give you a little more example on how some of the uses of this have been, how each of there are different activities that you do in that physical space. One of the things that we've been looking at is how do you how do we order those activities so that they flow into each other, or so that if somebody begins in point A and they go to point B, they get what they need, and without having to go through C and D. So we've been using that to prototype that flow of information and replicate that flow of information with the activities that people have to do. So these are some of the examples. It's not, I know I haven't given you the whole full spectrum, but because of time, Ashanti, I just wanted to give you just a sense of what you were asking about. So, and then Addison gives a great example, creating a plane with input from participants. Yes, exactly. So Monica has a question. She says, design is a verb action and knowledge is a known thing. What is the meaning of the graph? You mean the one that I'm showing right now? I am a little lost on the question. I guess you're talking about the illustration that we have on the screen. So if that's the case, and you can correct me, Monica. So what I'm saying is that the act of design generates knowledge, and that knowledge informs the design, and the design creates new knowledge. So the verb informs that noun. The more design action, the more knowledge comes out of that, and then it informs the action that you will continue to do. So I hope that is answering. Yeah, let me know in the chat if that hit the mark. I'm sorry, let me go back here. And Jasmine is just introducing herself. So welcome, Jasmine, to the discussion. And then is the purpose of design, is the purpose to design the knowledge? I think that's what you're asking. So no, the purpose is to design something that you need to design either a process or a solution, something that you need to accomplish a goal. But the point that I am making is that as you go through that process, knowledge is informing every step of the process. So from a knowledge management perspective, what I am advocating is that when you are going through the process to get to your eventual final product, you want to make sure that you apply the same design principles you would apply to the capture and sharing of knowledge in larger processes. So for example, if you go through that empathy process and you capture that knowledge, how would you use that knowledge for other processes other than design thinking? If you get that empathy, that information about that empathy state about the end users, how does that apply to other areas? How do you take that knowledge? How do you store it? How do you share it with the organization for other purposes? So that's what I mean. So Ashanti asks, is the design, so it's designing the flow of knowledge, but it's done iteratively to prevent loss and risk. In many ways, yes, Ashanti. In many ways, yes, it's designing the flow of knowledge. It's how it's not necessarily exclusively about the flow of knowledge, but it is in many ways the flow of knowledge, because remember, the design thinking is a process that you use for different purposes. One of them could be, and I often talk to people, and you know, the other design, Bill can also speak to that. That sometimes you don't necessarily have to apply all the steps of design thinking. Sometimes just the empathy is enough for you to get an understanding, the empathy process, to get an understanding of who the participants are, who the users are. Sometimes I have used design thinking just to clarify what the problem is, to define what the problem is. Sometimes you need to have that before you even move on to the solution. You know, so it is about designing the flow of knowledge. Overall, yes. Okay, let's move to the next slide. And thank you everybody for your questions. I am sorry that we're not able to get you on mic. I think we're still having some technical issues. So again, another provocative question: can design thinking make KM better? Again, it's provocative, but I kind of want to see what our opinions are. So Tura says, empathy is an important part of learning about how someone makes decisions, a key KM activity. Absolutely, absolutely. If we're going to share knowledge or we're going to capture knowledge, that knowledge is going to be used by somebody. Somebody's going to use it for a particular goal. So we want to make sure that we have a full understanding of who they are so they can apply that knowledge. Because knowledge management is not only, as I said before, it's not only about acquiring knowledge, it's not only about sharing knowledge, but it's about applying knowledge. So you're right, Turo. We want to have a full understanding of who the end user is, because they're going to take that knowledge that they are going to retrieve from a particular storage area and apply it in their day-to-day in their, you know, so how do we make that knowledge relevant? That's where it's important to have that understanding of who the person is. So Jasmine says, from my vantage point, empathy builds through effective user-focused products. Yes, that generates true return on investment. You're right, and it's not always monetary. You have to keep the user in mind at every step of the process. That's why we talk about participatory design. That's why we talk about having that constant feedback loop. And that's why we talk about that sort of, the knowledge that is generated informs the design, and then the design informs the knowledge, etc. So Allison is sharing a knowledge base. So in enterprise knowledge, thank you, Allison. I really appreciate that. So if you have a second, please check out her knowledge base. And again, you use that example of a knowledge base. That's just imagine for many of those of you who built a knowledge base, think about designing a knowledge base, but from using design thinking processes. You know, or if you're designing a repository, which is something that I am currently doing with a number of teams in my organization. When you're thinking about designing something like a knowledge base or a repository, you have to think about the actions that the end users will do. But it's more than that. That's why the design thinking process is so helpful, because it helps us to think about how that knowledge will flow, move through, and be used by the end users. So now let's go to we're moving towards the middle, almost towards the end of the discussion, but I want to take a minute. This is where we're going to get into the discussion. Pretty much what we've been saying, we're going to kind of look at it more from a little bit more practical. So I wanted to show you two things here. You're very familiar with it, all of you. Here's the design thinking cycle on the left. And then on the right, you have the knowledge life cycle. So I wanted to show you bring those back to your thinking, because these are not necessarily processes that are one-to-one, but this is important to visualize them, because I want us to discuss how they interact. All that we've been talking about applying design thinking and empathy and all these different processes, I want you to kind of think about it, but by looking at both processes next to each other. Because what happens in what I am talking about is how these two circles merge into one, or not necessarily merge into one, how they complement each other. So yes, we will share this information. I will share it with Tara and the team so that you can get the slides, Ashanti. We'll have the slides for you. So Tara and Pascal, I will share that with them. And I think this is recorded. I think, if I'm not mistaken, it's recorded, so you can go back and take a look at it. So yes, Bill is saying that there is a recording of this. So I wanted you to see the process, I wanted you to visualize the process, as I'm saying, because I want us to start thinking, look at the arrows, look at the circle. This is what we're going to talk about in terms of now, where is knowledge springing up? Where are we capturing, sharing knowledge? So now that we've seen this, any question on this before we move forward? I just wanted you to use this as a base for our discussion. Okay, so let's go now to the practical analysis. So this is where I wanted, basically pretty much what we've been talking about is illustrated in the screen. So what you see at the top, those are the basic steps of design thinking. And if you look at design thinking models, some may add one or a second step, but the basic design thinking model has the empathy, definition, the ideation process, the prototyping, and the testing. So one thing that I want to do is for us to see that, as I mentioned, it is iterative. So the empathy informs the definition, but that can go back, that definition that can go back and have us take a second look at the end user, and then the definition influences the ideation. So I just kind of want you to see, and those of you who've been working in design thinking, you fully understand this process of, this is where you see those arrows, that is exactly that iterative process, that is the back and forth. So my discussion here is, what I am looking at is what is happening where those arrows are interacting. That's the process where knowledge management comes into play, in terms of capturing, in terms of sharing, even storing and using that information, applying it for later. So that's the reason why I wanted you to. So you have a question about this, Ashanti. You say, what about auditing? Can you take a little bit of time to maybe just expand a little more on that question so I can answer it for you? I think I know where you're going, but I just want to make sure that I hit the mark when I respond to your question. So at this stage, so what I was saying before was that those arrows, that's the process where the knowledge goes back and forth. And this is where I want to bring your attention. So what I'm going to do now is, as you see below, these are some of the examples of the things that will happen. So, for example, if we talk about empathy, at the empathy stage, we could be creating new knowledge because we're discovering what is. How would this look? I'm going to take a minute to reread Ashanti's question. How would this look if one is auditing knowledge? Okay, great question, Ashanti. Let me answer that in a quick second. So if you are auditing knowledge and you are thinking about a design thinking process, one of the things that you would probably want to think about is, how do you put together, how do you design that audit instrument? Would you use, for example, when I've done knowledge management audits, I've used, for example, storytelling. Or if I've used a focus group, I think about, will the questions help me define what the problem is? So if you think about this, applying it to knowledge auditing, if you think about each of these steps, for example, you could come up with a prototype of the instrument to capture the information, and you could even test that prototype. So just the very instrument that you use for to do your audit can be the result of a design thinking process, because the problem that you're trying to define may be, well, what is the best instrument to capture, to do a knowledge audit, given the complexity of the organization that you are in? Is it maybe just doing focus groups, or using stories, or using interviews? So this could be a process where you apply that to figure out what it is that you would want to use for to capture the knowledge. You can also use the design thinking process to think about, well, you know, what's going to happen to that knowledge that comes out of the design of the audit process. I can tell you, when I did the knowledge audit for my organization, what we did was we used the knowledge from that knowledge audit, the data that we collected, to build the knowledge management strategy for the organization. So I did a 3-4 month long knowledge audit, interviewing everybody through focus groups, stories, etc. So I applied many different types of techniques to capture all of that data. So there are many ways that you can use this, Ashanti. So if you have other questions, keep them coming. We're moving towards the end of the discussion. So what I want to show you then is the empathy process could be a process of, you're very welcome, Ashanti. So the empathy process can be a process where you're generating new knowledge, because you're learning new information about the end user. But it's also a process of sharing knowledge, where they are sharing knowledge with you. So as a knowledge management person, you want to think, well, how do I make that process, that part of the design thinking process, that empathy process, what can I do to make the knowledge sharing more effective? How can I get them to share knowledge in a more effective way? Like I said, I keep going back to storytelling as one example. There are many others, you know. So then if you move to the next step, there's knowledge that's been acquired. You go to the definition. When you come up with a definition, you're actually creating knowledge. But also, it could be a sharing process where everybody's contributing to the discussion of what is it that we're talking about? What is the problem that we're trying to fix? So that's a sharing process. It could also be a collection process, because you're collecting all the different definitions to then pick one that will allow you to move to the ideation phase. And as you see in the ideation phase, again, I'm sorry, let me go back. Hold on a second. Sorry, my screen just got out of the whack here. So when you go to the ideation process, that's the process where you are generating a ton of ideas to figure out which is the prototype that you're going to work on to get to your final process. So that ideation process is a sharing process, but it's also a collection. Maybe you want to collect all the ideas because you're going to use one now, but you might discover, and this is knowledge generation, you might discover in the process that there's some really good ideas that might not be good at this moment, but they could apply later for other problems that you have ahead. So this is a collection, an issue or a moment where you can collect those ideas. Again, from a knowledge management perspective, how do you collect them? How do you store them in a way that people can find them and use them? This is where that knowledge management foundation is important to inform the design thinking process. So as we move through the process, and again, I'll take you back to the arrows moving back and forth, you know, when you go through that process of collecting ideas, you may discover that all of your ideas are following a particular theme. So you may see this a theme about process, for example, and you may be thinking, well, I'm getting a lot of ideas about process, but a lot of what we're looking at is more about mechanics, for example, and not necessarily about a process overall, but maybe it's about hardware or it's about application. So you've discovered that as you're collecting your ideas, you're getting ideas that are one-sided. So that means you have to go back and maybe do redefine the problem so that it can yield ideas that will hit what you're trying to solve. In other words, what I'm trying to say is that each step informs the next one and it moves us a little bit further. So I'm going to move to the last two steps, the prototyping. As I said, the prototyping is, I have collection here, but many different knowledge processes could happen here where its creation, because you're creating a prototype. It could be, it's a process where you're also collecting all the different pieces that you're putting together for the prototype. Creating the prototype could create new knowledge. You're learning new things. That's tacit knowledge that is actually coming into view as you're doing the prototype. And then when you get to that testing phase, this is where new knowledge comes out. You're learning new things. You are, when you go through that testing phase, that's a moment where you're sharing knowledge, where the people who, your participants who are testing the product or the solution or the process that you're creating, that knowledge that comes out of that testing is new knowledge that will inform the entire process. Again, that's why when you look at knowledge management, when you look at design thinking models, you see arrows moving all over the place, because that's the knowledge that is circulating through the different phases and through the overall process. So this is what I wanted you to take a minute to think about in this practical analysis. This is, it can be a little bit more sophisticated, but I wanted to simplify it just so you could get the mental model right away. Tura says it's hard to name a process that does not benefit from conscious application of KM. Do you think the same can be said of design thinking that is universally applicable? Well, I think that, I like your question, Tura. I think that design thinking is, to me, design thinking is a way to discover knowledge. I know this is a little controversial, but I'll say it anyway. I think that design thinking in itself is a knowledge management process, because, or it's a knowledge process, because it's a way to discover and generate knowledge. So it's a tool that we can use for that process. So I think that that's why they're both. Many times people see design thinking as a separate thing, but for me, from a person who practices knowledge management or implements knowledge management practices and tools, I see design thinking squarely within knowledge management, because everything is about, like I said at the beginning, it is about knowledge. It is for knowledge. It creates knowledge. It transforms knowledge. Jasmine asked, okay, Jasmine, you take care. Thank you so much. We're almost done. We're almost finishing up here. Monica says, in terms of the organizational knowledge creation theory, prototype is explicit knowledge creation. Yes, absolutely. That's the process where I was talking about. At that point, you're taking all of that tacit knowledge and you're making it explicit. So that's perfect. And then the final slide here that I want to share with you is, let's see if I can move forward. Hold on a second. There was a question here, but I think we answered it. What would a KM strategy look like with a design thinking approach? I'm going to skip this question because I think we covered an answer to that in the previous provocative question that we had. So the last question, the last point here is in terms of in the conclusion, and this is more, and I'm going to ask you, for those of you who are able to stay for the next 2 or 3 minutes, to please, if you can, put your answers in the chat. So the question is, what is the role of KM in design thinking? And of course, some of that has been answered already. I just use a couple of terms here, just so to kind of lead the discussion. If you're the KM person working with a design thinking team, you can be the person that's doing that translation between bringing that knowledge management, explaining the knowledge management or applying the knowledge management framework to design thinking. Like, you can either be the person doing the investigation, doing the research about the end user, explaining also, visualizing, or, which is different here, envisioning, thinking about how the knowledge will flow once this process is created. You are the person that may partner, bring other people into the process of design thinking, bringing other voices in those stories that we're talking about. The knowledge management person can be embedded in a design thinking team, or partner with a design thinking process, a design thinking person. So there are many ways that knowledge management can play a role in design thinking processes. Ashanti says, understanding the knowledge ecosystem. You can bring that, and that's a great point, Ashanti. You, as the knowledge management person, may have a pretty good understanding of the knowledge ecosystem of the organization, and you can bring that information to the design thinking team or the design thinking practitioner that is working in your organization. So there are many ways that you can find a critical role for knowledge management when you're working with design thinking. I'm going to stop for a second in case anybody wants to add anything else. And while I do that, I am going to go to the final slide. If we have any questions, any feedback, thank you, Andre. I appreciate your comment. I don't know if we have any other comments. We're wrapping up in a few minutes. So Allison is putting out some information about upcoming KMI courses. Awesome, thank you. This is great for the Enterprise Knowledge Group. I did a presentation a couple of years back with Tara on storytelling over at the Enterprise Knowledge facilities. Great facilities you guys have. So thank you, Bill. We totally understand the issue with the recording. So no problem, I appreciate it. Thank you, everybody. I appreciate your time. And let me just put at here, if you want to contact me, here's my information at the bottom. That's my email address. You can find me on LinkedIn and you can find me on Twitter as well. Thank you, everybody. I'm going to leave the screen up for a few more minutes.
Okay, and thank you, everyone, for attending. I don't know if Johel can
Thanks,
hear me.
Denise. Thank you, Tora. Appreciate it. Thank you.
Okay. And Tara's on the phone, so she wants to also say thank you and good night. Tara, you want to talk?
Yeah, Joel, thank you so much for this wonderful presentation. And thanks to everybody for attending, and we'll see you next month. Yay!
Okay, great. And I'll go ahead and let people unmute themselves. They want to say anything. Final
Awesome.
thing. I think we're good. I think we're good.
Thank you, Tara.
Mm-hmm. Okay, with that, and I'm going to go ahead and shut off the recording.
Thank you for watching KMCDC's presentation. Hope to see you at the next monthly meeting.